Hi, welcome back to the MERA25 Italian channel, here always with Simone Mariotti. And today we are going to speak with Pauline, a journalist and researcher originally from Belgium, but who has dedicated much of her work to understand Ukraine. After completing a master's degree in conference interpreting and the second one in Eastern European Studies, she spent a year at Reuters in Poland, if I remember well, in Gdansk. I will ask her later when she will be on the screen. She then returned to academia to pursue a PhD in political economy, focusing on Ukraine's wartime institution. Her connection to the country runs deep. She first traveled to Ukraine as a child and now splits her time between Berlin and Kiev. Welcome, Pauline. Thank you so much for being with us today. We truly appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Hi, Simone. Thank you. Very glad to be here with you, and thank you for having me.
I'm really glad to have you too. We know each other for a while now, and we even traveled together to Ukraine in the summer of 2023. We were volunteering with an organization clearing ruins in bombed areas. But today, I would like to go beyond the day-to-day news cycle. I want to take a step back, and explore the broader context of the war, the actors involved, and how both Ukraine and Russia are navigating these conflicts. Also because, of course, the news every day we have some news from the States, from Ukraine, from Russia. So it's difficult to be updated in real time, and I prefer to have a conversation with you in a different style. So to start, I'd like to go back to when we first met. We were at a house party in Berlin, and while most people were dancing and drinking, we ended up in a deep conversation about Russia. That was around 5 years ago, and I still remember asking you why you were so interested in the region. So you say something to me that really stuck. You say something like, Russia is a country that has fought so many battles throughout history, yet somehow always end up losing. So this remain always stuck in my head. But given the situation today, do you still feel the same way about Russia? Because the conflict is ongoing, nothing is set in stone yet, but clearly Russia shows no sign of backing down. And not even someone like Donald Trump, for instance, who has claimed he could end the war within 24 hours of being elected, seems to have a solution for dealing with Putin. And also in these days, we can see that is still taking time. The next 1 week, the next 2 weeks, we will see if it's possible to have a peace. So, what's your opinion about what you told me that evening 5 years ago about Russia?
Well, what I meant when I said that at the time, I think, is that the Russian people, or in a more correct way, whoever people were living under Russian authority, have always kind of lived in a very miserable way and under autocratic power. And what I meant with that is that you see the Russian people have tried at least twice in the 20th century to topple their autocratic leaders. In 1905 and 1917, there were two revolutions against an autocratic leader in the face of the Tsar of Russia, of the Russian Empire at the time, which were both unfortunately unsuccessful, because even the 1917 one, which brought about the power of the Bolsheviks and the creation of the Soviet Union after quite bloody civil war, did not really bring any democratic change. That was kind of the idea behind the demonstrations and the revolution at the time. And the Soviet Union, in many ways, was as autocratic as the Russian Empire. And I said the Russian people, but actually it's a lot more than the Russian people. It's, as I said, whoever was living under the authority of the Russian emperor or the secretary generals of the Soviet party sitting in Moscow, and now under the authority of President Putin. And I still do believe that the Russians, or the people who are the subjects of the Russian Federation, because Russia is a very multi-ethnic country. There are not only ethnical Russians living in Russia, there's a whole lot of different ethnicities all living together in the Russian Federation under the authority of Putin. I do believe that they are still losing the fight. In a sense, not a military sense. I am not a military expert. I cannot give you the details of what's going on in the battlefield. But the Russian people, the people living in the Federation of Russia, have absolutely nothing to gain from this war. They have absolutely nothing to get from it. Russia definitely does not need more territory. I mean, it's the biggest country on earth. It already has, so much territory to start with. And the Russian people, what do they have to gain from this? They are, chipping about the territory of Ukraine. What they're getting from it is rubble, the completely destroyed cities. If you look at even still area satellite photos of cities like Mariupol or Avdiivka, or cities in the region of Donetsk, Luhansk, there's nothing left there. There are villages and completely destroyed cities. What does that bring to the Russian people? What do they get in exchange for their many sacrifices, for the fact that they are sending their sons, brothers, fathers to the front and dying in huge numbers? What do they get for that? They don't really get anything. This war for the Russian people makes no sense if you think about it logically, And so in that sense, they are still losing the fight, if there's any fight left to fight, because I think it's been a long time since there has been any real political activity in the civil society of Russia. It's quite a quiet civil society for many reasons, because a lot of people are imprisoned or have fled the country, etc. So maybe they're not fighting anymore, but if there was some kind of fight, I think the Russian society definitely has lost it and keeps losing it.
Yeah, thank you very much for your answer. Finally, after 5 years, I gave an answer to your sentence. But I would like to go focusing more on your PhD studies, since your research focus on Ukraine's institution in wartime and how the war is affecting democratic effort. I would like to ask you, in the midst of full-scale war, how have Ukraine's institutions managed to function? And I would also add something more. It's a short question, but quite long. Which democratic processes have been preserved? Where have compromise been necessary? And what role are local governments and civil society playing in keeping governance alive?
Right. So that is a very, very difficult question for a lot of obvious reasons, but I will try to make it as clear as I can with the knowledge that I have. So Ukraine, before it was invaded by Russia, in what the Ukrainians call the full-scale invasion, because the war in Ukraine, of course, did not start in 2022. It started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and what Ukrainian called little green men, what was at the time unknown soldiers pouring into the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. So the Ukrainians call this invasion that happened in 2022 the full-scale invasion, because it was kind of a step up from what was happening before already in the east of the country. And so before the full-scale invasion, before 2022, Zelensky had been in office for 3 years, a little bit less. So he was elected in 2019. He was elected in quite a tumultuous time, because the president before him, Petro Poroshenko, had been elected after Euromaidan, right after the entire events that had unleashed the flight of Viktor Yanukovych, who was the autocratic president at the time, to Russia, the annexation of Crimea, as I said, the start of the war in what we call the Donbass. Petro Poroshenko was a new face, tried to bring Ukraine back into a more pro-EU path, which meant having to tackle a lot of problems in the ways in which Ukraine was trying to become more democratic. A lot of these problems were linked with excessive centralization, which meant that the central power, the government had immense power also over the regions. And now Ukraine is a very big country. It was kind of not very democratic for the government, the president, to have so much power over the Ukrainian regions. And so there was a lot of work that was done, not only under Petro Poroshenko, but then again under Volodymyr Zelensky once he was elected, to create more powerful local governors and decentralize, if you will, Ukrainian politics. So this was a process that continued under Zelensky, as I said, from 2019 to 2022. Zelensky also started a huge process of what he called de-oligarchization, because I'm sure you're aware that the term oligarchs and Ukraine are often put together, because indeed, for a very long time, there were these really, really powerful figures that we call oligarchs who had way too much power over a lot of things in Ukraine. The definition of an oligarch is a person who has a lot of money, in general several million US dollars as net worth, and wields power over the media and over politics, whether local or central. And there were quite well-known oligarchs who were working with the presidents for a very long time. So, for example, Viktor Yanukovych was backed by oligarchs who were from his native region, from the Donbass, who had a lot of money and who could make sure that the media would paint a really good picture of him, and that there would only be coverage of his campaign and of his ideas and everything. So that was how important oligarchs were up until Euromaidan, up until the arrival of Poroshenko. But the problem is that Poroshenko was also an oligarch. So Poroshenko is, we call him the king of chocolate, because he owns a candy company called Roshen. And he was himself an oligarch. Now, not a pro-Russian one, a pro-Europe one, but still an oligarch. And so when Zelensky came to power, his whole shtick, his whole campaign went on de-oligarchization of the country, to make sure that for once the president would not be an oligarch himself and would not be linked to oligarchs. So even though himself, Zelensky, was backed by an oligarch, his campaign was financed and helped by a man called Kolomoisky, who was a bank magnate, also an oligarch. At some point, Zelensky kind of got rid of him, and he got rid of a lot of oligarchs, and he created a law called the Law on De-Oligarchization to make sure that if someone was very rich and had political influence, they could not own media. So that pushed a lot of oligarchs, a lot of very rich people in Ukraine, to sell their media, and a lot more media freedom appeared. And Zelensky tried to make sure that there were a lot more transparent ways to deal with these really rich and really powerful people. And Zelensky was really trying to de-oligarchize his country, to decentralize his country, maybe not perfectly, but at least that was his promise, and that's what he was on paper trying to do. Now, of course, with the start of the full-scale invasion, the first thing that they did is launch the martial law. And the martial law has many, many sub-laws inside it, and one of them is that, of course, the president will have to wield way more power than he is supposed to do in the constitution of Ukraine. Because, I mean, it kind of makes sense, you know, the country's at war, you have to be able to take decisions fast, you have to be able to make decisions without having to ask permission to person XYZ, because that takes a lot of time. You have to be able to gather the resources necessary, and you have to limit the freedoms of the people living in your country. There is no other choice. So that's what happened. The martial law was passed, and then an insane amount of power was put into the hands of the president, his administration, and the people around him. This, of course, is not very democratic by essence. If power is very centralized in someone's hands, that doesn't allow for competition, that doesn't allow for opposition, that doesn't allow for a lot of things that are necessary for democracy to survive. So I think it would be impossible for Ukraine to remain very democratic right now. I think if you would compare to how, let's say, Churchill's cabinet was working during the Second World War, I'm pretty sure it also lost a lot of its democratic capacities, right? I think that is something that just happens when a country is at war. However, there is a lot of scrutiny on Ukraine because of the fact that the EU is giving Ukraine so much money to defend itself. So now, there has been this new partnership, the negotiations for Ukraine to enter the EU. And as any country that wishes to enter the EU, Ukraine has to check a bunch of boxes on the list. And all of these boxes have to do with democratization, decentralization, and the rule of law. And so there is this duality right now in Ukraine where, on the one hand, the presidential institution is way too powerful, and the president can issue decrees and can make decisions on his own without really consulting the parliament. Also, of course, there is the fact that the president cannot leave his office. There cannot be elections. That is written in the constitution of Ukraine, that if there is a war, no elections can be had. And so, of course, this is also anti-democratic because he was chosen back in 2019. Maybe if Ukrainians were to go to choose a president right now, they wouldn't choose him. That's absolutely possible. We don't know. It's impossible to know because organizing elections would mean trying to get people together. That could be dangerous because Russia likes to target places where people are gathering. Also, how would we get all the votes from all the diaspora living abroad, the people who are fighting in the front, the people who are in prison as prisoners of war in Russia? There's a lot of questions on how it's even possible to organize elections in a war. But at the same time, even though you can see an obvious democratic backsliding in Ukraine, at the same time, the EU is there as a watchdog, always watching and checking that Ukraine is still trying to implement, to the best of its ability, some pro-democratic measures. And then you have the third part of this, I will call it pyramid, which is the civil society. And the civil society of Ukraine is extremely active. We have seen it lately. I don't know if you followed the news with the parliament passed a law that would strip the independence of two organizations called NABU and SAP, which are anti-corruption organizations, and which can launch investigations into people, usually powerful people, for cases of corruption. And there was this new law that was passed by the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament of Ukraine, which would basically allow the Procurator General, who is linked to the president, who was chosen by the president, to take over some cases from NABU and from SAP, from these two organizations, which is also very anti-democratic. And when this law was passed, people went to the streets, even though there is a war, even though I was myself there. I went to some of the protests, and it was possible that at some point the air alerts would start and you would have the sirens blaring in the background. But people were still there, standing in really, really big numbers in many cities across Ukraine, fighting against this idea. So you can see that civil society, even during war, and maybe somehow even more so during war, is active and is ready to defend what they're actually fighting for, because they're fighting for the very existence of their country. They're fighting for their values. And so they cannot accept a government that kind of backtracks on these values, of course. And so we have these three things that can kind of fight against each other. The fact that the war is creating less democracy, but also the fact that civil society and the EU are kind of forcing the Ukrainian government to stay on track at the same time, if that makes sense.
Okay, you make me think from what you said. In a way, I see the suspension of election create a risk of long-term democratic erosion, and at the same time, as you talk about Ukrainian people also, in a way they engage in democratic life, but in wartime condition, you see strengthened social cohesion or reveal new divides, and what role also the media plays, because we talk about the people, but also the media in democratic discourse under these circumstances. So what role they play? And I like to understand a bit better also the Ukrainian society during this time, since you spend also quite a lot of time there, so you can tell us something more about the Ukrainian people, what they think, what they are facing. When we were there, I remember we were in 2023, and I remember this Ukrainian guy told us, yeah, we just came out from COVID where we were always at home, also in the evening with the ceasefire. After the COVID, the war started and there was again the ceasefire. So I would like to know something more from your side, since you spent time there, and something more about the Ukrainian people, the cohesion, or if there are some frictions between the people and the media, the role played by the media today.
Sure. I think, I mean, I cannot talk, of course, for every Ukrainian. I can tell you from what I observe, from the people that I have around me when I spend time in Kyiv, and from what I know also from my research. So I think the Ukrainian people in big numbers are quite allied in the fight against Russia. So I think that the fight for Ukraine against the enemy that is Russia is a factor of cohesion, is creating some kind of understanding. In political science, we call that a rally around the flag effect. So basically, there is a threat to Ukrainian nationhood, to the country of Ukraine, to the Ukrainian language, to the Ukrainian culture, to everything that makes a Ukrainian Ukrainian. And that will bring a lot of people, however big their Ukrainianness is, so whether they speak Ukrainian as a mother language or not, whether they identify with the Ukrainian culture very strongly or not, that will bring them together around the Ukrainian flag, around this symbol of Ukrainianness in the fight against Russia. Now, of course, this is not the case for everyone. There are people in Ukraine still now who believe that they have some kind of kinship with the Russian Federation, because of course there is a common history. The two countries were in the same country at some time, I mean many times, under the Russian Empire and then under the Soviet Union in different ways. And what's interesting is that Ukraine is actually the what is now the Ukrainian territory was divided many times. So, for example, the east of Ukraine was mostly under Russian influence, under the Russian Empire, under the Soviet Union. And the east of Ukraine, so for example, where the Donbass is, since the very beginning of the Soviet Union, was part of the Soviet Union, whereas there were parts of Western Ukraine that only became parts of the Soviet Union after 1945, after the Second World War. So even the Ukrainians don't have the same understanding, if you will, of their own relationship with the Russian Federation, with the Russians, with the Soviet power, with the history, etc. Because the west of Ukraine, through time, was divided between Poland, between the Austrian Empire, between Poland, Lithuania, etc., etc. So the people were kind of divided, and now you can see that there is quite a strong cohesion and maybe less prejudices between them as there were before. So I think before the war, there might have been a lot of prejudices between people from the west of Ukraine who used to be predominantly Ukrainian speaking, attached to Ukrainian culture, and the people of the east of Ukraine, which especially in big cities would rather be Russian speaking, even though this is also not a generality. A lot of villages in eastern Ukraine, including in the Donbass, have always been Ukrainian speaking. And it was rather a thing of the city, a thing to be cool or to be accepted to speak Russian. But this was more of the case in the east of Ukraine than in the west of Ukraine. And in Kyiv. Kyiv, also as the capital, used to be quite Russian speaking. I can see the difference myself when I go there now versus when I went there before the war. Now you hear a lot more Ukrainian than you would before the war. And I think definitely there is this newfound alliance maybe between Ukrainians in the fact that they understand that this is a war they have to fight. And I think polls show that the majority of Ukrainians still want to fight this war. They still want to continue in this way. A lot of them agree that Zelensky has to remain the president, even though they didn't vote for him in the past 5.5 years. I think this kind of, there is an understanding in that way. However, the Ukrainian society is also, there's a lot of complicated questions. For example, the language question is a very big one, and often people kind of misunderstand the language question, because nearly everyone in Ukrainian is essentially bilingual, either passively or actively, which means that even if someone is a Russian speaker, has never spoken a Ukrainian word in their life, they will understand Ukrainian perfectly, because first of all, the languages are quite similar. You can get a basis of Ukrainian if you understand Russian, and vice versa. And also because, well, those two languages were kind of living together next to each other the whole time. Now, since the full-scale invasion, people who used to be speaking Ukrainian keep speaking Ukrainian. Some people who used to be speaking Russian as a mother language decided to switch to Ukrainian and are now speaking nearly only Ukrainian. And some people who were speaking Russian before continue to speak Russian. And you can see in Kyiv, for example, that these two languages continue to coexist. So I see a lot of conversations, for example, where someone will speak Ukrainian because by law, taxi drivers, restaurants, services in general, they have to be able to speak to you in Ukrainian. But the other person responds in Russian, and they have a whole conversation like that. One speaking Ukrainian, the other one speaking Russian. And you do not see a lot of outspoken discrimination against either one of them. So you won't see people starting a fight because one of them is speaking Russian and one of them is speaking Ukrainian. However, there is, especially I think among younger people who have decided to adopt the Ukrainian language as a way to rebel against the colonial history of Russia inside Ukraine, to rebel against the fact that the Russian language is being used as a political tool by Putin to justify the wars he launches around the post-Soviet Union, whether it is in Ukraine or whether it was in Georgia in 2008. And so these people who have made the conscious decision to start speaking Ukrainian probably have a lot of prejudice against the people who have not, who have decided to continue speaking Russian, which is technically, of course, their right. They have the right to speak Russian. Nobody's going to stop them from doing so. But there is, in this case, dissension between the people, whether it's right or not to keep speaking Russian, whether everyone should be switching to Ukrainian, and whether it's morally acceptable to speak the language of the occupier. This is a point of tension that I can observe myself. For example, I think it's not very salient right now. It doesn't lead to very violent behaviors. It might become a problem later, potentially, but right now I think this gathering around the idea that they have to fight, that they are in a war, and that they have to be united to win this war, kind of supplants the dissensions that are within Ukrainians. Okay, it's kind of more important, if you want. This is the priority. And it's also the case when we talk about democratic backsliding. The government knows that what they are doing is anti-democratic, but they know also that they are fighting for the existence of the nation. What is the point of the nation being democratic if it doesn't exist anymore? So, of course, the existence of the nation, the Ukrainianness, precedes over democracy for now, as a temporary measure. Of course, it cannot last like that for too long, and of course, it cannot be like that once, hopefully, the war is over. So this is what I can observe from how united or disunited the Ukrainian society is. I think it would be very interesting to see how this will evolve once the war is over and once this unity kind of wears off after the hostilities stop, basically.
I would like at this point, I have to say sorry to you because I would like to make in a way the same question I just asked you about Ukrainian people, but related to Russian people. And I know that you are focusing now on Ukraine, but you have a huge background about Russia culture, history, society. So probably you can also tell me something related to Russian society. I met a lot of Russian, of course, when in Berlin or outside of Russia, and they have a different opinion probably from what we heard, what we usually hear from the TV, and also it's kind of related, the question about Russian people and how the media here in Europe promote the Russian culture, society, and way of being of people there. So I find I'm better. I'm curious to know what do you think also with your experience in Reuters. How was the approach of the media against Russia, let's say?
Sure. So yeah, I do have a strong history with Russia as well, which is sometimes hard, to be honest with you, because it is a country that I love, that I loved spending time in, and I traveled there, lived there for a while, made a lot of friends, and I was really interested in Russia. I felt empathy for the Russian people for what they had to go through throughout history. It's a country that suffered a lot, as we mentioned in the beginning, and had to go through a lot of very, very difficult things in history. But so the last time I was in Russia was 2019. I was spending some months in Siberia, in the Altai region, which is a region in the middle of nowhere, kind of in the central south part of Siberia, close to China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan. So as far as Moscow as you can possibly get. And while I was there, I met a lot of people, and this was 2019, so it was already after the beginning of the war in Donbass and the annexation of Crimea. And Russians were absolutely certain that Crimea was theirs, even though a lot of them had never set foot in Crimea, had never been there, didn't even probably know what it looks like. But they were absolutely sure that it was right for Crimea to have. They don't even call in Russian. They don't call it an annexation for Crimea. They say присоединение, which means the coming back of Crimea, the realignment of Crimea with Russia, if you will, as if they had regained something that they had lost. And most people I talked to, yeah.
But sorry, is the same related to Kiev? Because for them, Kiev is part of Russia, no? It's the cradle in a way, or am I wrong?
Well, Kiev is the creator not of Russia, but of a state called the Kievan Rus. And of course, Russia takes its name from the Kievan Rus, but basically the Kievan Rus was a proto-state, if you will, that was created by the Scandinavians. So technically, Kiev was at the time a Scandinavian place. And the Kievan Rus was quite a powerful, strong empire, and it adopted the Orthodox religion quite early on, aligning itself with Byzantium, with Constantinople. And the creation of the Kievan Rus allowed for some princes to go east and allowed for the creations of city like Moscow, which was created indeed after Kiev, which is younger than Kiev. But what historians call the Muscovy is maybe a branching out of the Kievan Rus, but is not in all ways a direct descendant of the Kievan Rus. It's just like Belgium is not completely a direct descendant of France. Of course, it's linked to France. That is also why part of the country speaks French. But history is way too complicated to just say, Kiev was created. Some people linked to Kiev created Moscow, so definitely those two places have to belong together. But that is what Muscovian emperors told themselves for a very long time, because they wanted to be associated with Kiev, because they wanted to be associated to the Orthodox religion. They wanted to see themselves as the third Rome, as this kind of very, very important city for the Orthodox religion. So after Rome, after Constantinople, Moscow would be the new religious center, if you will, of the world. And in order to do that, they have to go back to the first princes who had been in the region Orthodox, and these were Kievan princes. So they had to always, remind everyone that they were linked in some way, whether it was true or not, to the Kievan princes. There is a really, really interesting book about that from a Ukrainian historian who works in an American university. I believe he works at Harvard. His name is Serhiy Plokhy, and he wrote a history of Russia called The Last Empire, and he describes it very well, how this idea that Moscow is a direct descendant of the Kievan Rus is actually a myth created by the princes of Muscovy at the time. So this whole idea goes back centuries and centuries. So of course, for Russian leaders now to have had this idea in their heads for so long can create some dissensions, and for Russian people also, because they have been told by their own governments, by their own media for years and years and years that Ukraine was theirs, that Ukraine was basically non-existent. It was just Russians calling themselves something else. And the proof of that was, of course, that they would speak Russian. In the idea of Putin, if you speak Russian, you are a Russian. And this idea is completely crazy because there are so many Russian speakers in the world who have nothing to do with Russian ethnicity. Look at Kazakhs, for example, Uzbeks, people Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Estonia. Even in Mongolia, some people would speak Russian. That doesn't make them Russian, and so they had this kind of like mixing up in their head of language, identity, nationality, what was theirs, what was not theirs. And the Russians have been victims for a very long time of very, very harsh propaganda. The media machine in Russia is crazy. I used to read myself media articles from state media such as RIA Novosti or TASS, who are two very, very big agencies covering Russia and the world in the Russian language. And there are, I don't want to sound crass, but there are nearly nothing but lies on these platforms. Everything is twisted, everything is presented in a way that will kind of implant an idea in the Russian people that Ukrainians are bad, or Georgians are bad, or Italians are bad. And they use things, they know how the Russian people think. They know that the Russian people is a rather religious people, a rather, how to say, not very liberal people, and they will use these values against them. They will say, oh, in Italy, everyone is either a Muslim or a gay, and that will make people react like, oh, I don't want to be associated with that in any way, So they must be depraved, they must be bad, and you can see that today Russia is giving out visas. I don't know if you heard about that, but they're giving out visas that they call shared values visas, where Westerners like you and me or someone from America could apply for a visa because they are unhappy with how their government is dealing with certain issues such as migration, LGBTQ rights, etc. And so these people can go to Russia to live their shared values of normal families, if you will, traditional families, and absolutely no gay people on the streets and certain things like that, and go to Russia and live in Russia under the protection of the Russian state. And there was this one case of this American guy who moved his entire family from Texas, I think, from the US, to Russia on the basis that he believed in these shared values, and he thought that this was a country that was aligned with his values. And I think very, very quickly after he arrived, he was actually sent to the front. He is now, I believe, on the front lines in Ukraine and fighting in a war that he has nothing to do with. And this is how Russia functions. It calls onto the emotions of people. It calls onto their core values, to what they believe, to twist their minds and create some kind of alternate reality for them, where the Russian people is the savior of the world. They are, as I said, the third Rome. They will save the world from depravity. They will save the world from homosexuals. They will save the world from anything that is bad in their own eyes. And this, of course, allows for people to justify this war in a way, to let it happen, to not do anything against it, to even think that maybe this war should be happening, that there is, there's this big propaganda thing about Ukraine being a Nazi state. And they base this idea on some historical facts that are completely twisted. So, they base this idea on the fact that during the time when Ukraine was occupied by the Nazis, some Ukrainians volunteered to create their own SS battalion, which was called SS Halichina, so Galician SS in the west of Ukraine. Now, it's true, this happened, but this happened in every single country that was occupied by the Nazis. It happened in Belgium, it happened in Luxembourg, it happened in the Netherlands, it happened everywhere. In every single country, people would go volunteer and work with the Nazis. This was nothing special, but somehow, they present this fact as if it was the only place where people could be so twisted that they would work with the Nazis. They also tell about this historical figure, very difficult historical figure called Stepan Bandera, who was a Ukrainian nationalist and who, for some time, collaborated with the Nazis as well, because he was fighting against two opponents. He was fighting against the USSR, the Russians, and he was fighting against the Polish people living in the west of Ukraine, also because of historical reasons. And he put his hopes, whether it was a good idea or not, into the Nazis, hoping that they would help him in his fight. Of course, that wasn't the case, and they had no interest in Ukraine being independent, and so he definitely made a strategic mistake in putting his hopes in these people, and he was actually sent to Sachsenhausen. He spent some time in the concentration camp in Sachsenhausen. So, again, historically somehow accurate. This person was linked to the Nazis, but completely twisted in a way that makes reality somehow completely different to what it was, an alternative version, if you will, of reality. And so that's what the Russian propaganda is so good at doing. It's using some small, tiny bit of truth and twisting it in a way that will make it completely out of hand, that will make it way bigger than it was, and that will really touch upon the emotions of people. And so I think the Russian society now is, I don't know if brainwashed is the right word, but they are in this alternative reality of the world where everything that is told, that is fed to them through information, through media, is twisted, is presented in a way that will glorify the Russian government, the Russian power. And I think what I see in Russians who decided to leave the country, there are a lot of people, Russian people, who write about the war in Ukraine, who are pro-Ukraine, who even went to Ukraine to write about what is going on in Ukraine. For example, I know that in the Kyiv Independent, this English-speaking media writing from Kyiv, one of their journalists is a Russian national. So there are Russians who are taking a stance, who are openly against the war in Ukraine. But I think what is interesting about this opposition, these liberals who decided to leave, is that they don't do a lot about it. They don't really try to get the people around them to take action. They don't. Maybe some do. I'm sure some do, but in the large majority, I mean, in a city like Berlin, where we both live, there are so many Russians, and it's like of course, they're against the war. They don't like the fact that Ukrainians are being killed, but at the same time, they don't really do anything about it. They don't talk about the hard things, about why this could even start in the beginning, about why so many people are for it, about what are the deep-rooted problems in the Russian society that allowed for this to happen, and that allowed for the civil society to just let it happen. And I think that is why a lot of Ukrainians have doubts about. I've heard a lot of Ukrainians saying there are no good Russians. And of course, that's a very exaggerated way of seeing things. But that means that in their view, Russians who are against the war could be doing a lot more. Now, personally, I don't know what a lot more could be. I don't know what is in their power to do. But, this is the reality about the Russian opposition, that even sometimes the Russian opposition has weird views about Ukraine. For example, take Yulia Navalnaya, the wife of the late Alexei Navalny, who was a famous oppositioner to Putin, and who was treated in an absolutely dreadful way in prison, and who ended up dying after also being poisoned in a plane, and had to be treated in the Charité hospital in Berlin, etc. And this person, Alexei Navalny, was also, of the opinion that Crimea belonged to Russia. He was also, maybe, would he still be alive? Would he be not completely against the idea that the Donbass should belong to Russia? Now, please don't misunderstand my saying that he was, he deserved in any way what happened to him. He did not. He was treated in an absolutely horrible, horrible way, and that was completely against any form of human rights. But what I'm saying is that even this really famous image of Russian opposition was so deeply persuaded by some greater power that the Russian ethnicity is somehow more important, or the creator or something, or that it's like, the civilizer in some way, that he could have also accepted what is happening in Ukraine right now for the good of Russia, for the good of the world, because Russia represents the world. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it was a really good answer. I thought so many things while you were talking, and when you talk about Italian, since of course I'm Italian, I was just thinking the best solution for Italian people if we have trouble with Russia is to send there some singers, because Russian they love so much Italian singers. Probably could be the best diplomatic way to solve problem with Russia. But anyway, it was really interesting what you were saying, and actually, I don't like when I do interview to ask about the future, because the future is always uncertain. I don't like to hear what people also think, because at least it's always a matter many times of just good fortune if you guess right or not. But in this case, since we were talking about the society, Russian and Ukrainian society, I was just wondering, uh, considering the situation, the political, the war situation, the consequences, what long-term psychological and social scars do you think this war will leave on both Russian and Ukrainian people?
Oof, yeah, that's a quite a big question. So let's
You
start with
brought me
Ukraine.
here. You brought me here with your. Yeah, exactly.
I did.
It's your
I,
fault.
I laid my own trap. Yes. So yes, I will start with Ukraine, and then I will touch up about on Russia. Again, because Ukraine, I know more about Ukraine, so I can kind of extrapolate a little bit more. Um, for Ukraine, I think obviously there is a lot of war fatigue. People still want to fight the war, but you can see that way less people are going to the army by themselves, are volunteering to go to the army. People are sleep deprived because Russia has a very cynical way of launching its air alerts on Ukraine, making, it's either you stay in your bed and you sleep, and maybe there's a slight chance that you will die in your sleep because a missile or a drone or whatever hits your house, or you decide to go to the shelter, but you don't sleep. And then in the morning, you have to get up, bring your kids to school, go to work, whatever. And this is a terrible, terrible dilemma that people have nearly every night when the sirens, start blaring in Ukraine. It's a dilemma that I have sometimes in Kiev. Sometimes the air alert sounds, and I look at my phone and I see that it's drones, and I'm like, ugh, whatever, I'm tired. I want to sleep. And I just go to sleep. And I know that that's the thing that a lot of Ukrainians decide to do. And and then,
Exactly.
the,
It's sorry if I interrupt you, but I also remember when we were there, and the alarm, we could hear it several times during our stay there, and it's interesting anyway how you can adapt quite easily, because people there, you see, they are used to that, to go to the bunker in the night. So I remember the first couple of nights I was really scared, and we were quite high on the building, and we had to do all the stairs. And actually, from the third, fourth night, it was okay. Let's go down to the bunker again. So you anyway adapt yourself. It's really interesting also in a anthropological, let's say, or a psychological way to see how people react in situation of war and situation of danger. Yeah, sorry, but I didn't want to interrupt you. But I just
no, of
remind me
course.
to our time there.
Yeah, no, it's a thing, it's I tend to try to go to the shelter now because also Russia has recently ramped up its attacks on Kyiv. It's now launching sometimes. in one night hundreds and hundreds of drones and several missiles at the same time. And so these are, particularly large attacks that are scary. They're just scary, you can't sleep. There's things exploding everywhere, air defense working, and it's something that it's just, yeah, it's not very nice to live through. And so I tend to try to go to the shelter. I tend to drag my partner Max with me, even though by himself he would probably not go. And but I see it's not something that a lot of people want to do, because it's, of course, they are being attacked nearly every night, sometimes several nights in a row. You don't want to not be able to sleep for several nights in a row. So some people just make the conscious choice of not going, of deciding, whatever, I'll take a chance. And I've heard so many Ukrainians say the word, if it hits, it hits. I can't control it anyway, I don't know where this missile is going. I don't know where this drone is going. If it's me, it's me. Whatever, And this is a very cynical of approaching things, but I think probably a way of defending oneself, also thinking, I can't stop living. I cannot stop everything in my life because this country decided to launch, I don't know how many 100 missiles on me, right now. So it's very hard, and I think Ukrainians are very tired. They're very, in all ways possible, psychologically tired. They're physically tired. A lot of them have lost friends, parents. Last time I was in Ukraine, I was at a funeral. I went to the funeral of the father of a friend of my partner's. I had never seen this guy in my life, either the friend or the dad. I just went to express my support, and I went to this funeral, and I couldn't help but cry. I cried a lot because it was just so sad to see that he was leaving such a big family behind, and he seemed like such a nice person. And his death, he decided to go to the army. He was fighting for his country, but at the same time, his death makes no sense. It should not have happened. He should not have been fighting against this invader had Russia not invaded. Like this is just, it's such a sad reality to be in, and so many families have been through this. I know people my age, in their 20s, who have been to a lot more funerals than weddings, and it's terrible. It's an awful reality. And of course, I think there will be, I'm no psychologist, but I think it's obvious that there will be very big psychological scars left in the society. There is also the thing of the whole, so much of the country being abroad now. So many people left Ukraine, several millions Ukrainians left Ukraine and are now living abroad. And the longer the war lasts, the more people ask themselves if they're ever going to come back, because maybe they have nothing to go back to. Maybe their house is destroyed. Maybe their husband died and they are building a new life somewhere else. Maybe their children started going to school in whatever country they ended up living in, and maybe these people will not go back to Ukraine. This will also be a big problem. There are people who fled Ukraine, men who did not want to go to the army and decided to leave Ukraine instead, illegally. These people are considered right now as traitors in some way by a lot of people. Will they come back? Will they be allowed to come back by the government? Will they not? There's so many questions that will have to be answered once the war is over, and that probably will create a lot of tension within society and between society and the government and the people in power. There is also the question of difference between men and women, which I think is a very big question, because men over the age of 18 are not allowed to leave the country. They have to stay in Ukraine. The age of mobilization is 25. So before 25, young men can volunteer if they want, but they cannot be forced to go to the army. Once they're 25, they can be forced. They can be mobilized. They can just be picked up on the street and sent straight away to the front. So there is this constant stress under which young Ukrainian men are. They cannot leave the country. So if they have family abroad, they cannot see their family. They cannot go in a place where there is less stress, where they are not at war. They cannot escape the war. There is no way for men to escape the war. Once they turn 23, 24, and they get closer to mobilization age, there is this constant stress about the possibility of their being sent to their very probable death. And it's, it's a very, very heavy burden to live with. It's just a very hard thing for such a young person to go through. On top of with already losing your friends and of being in a state of constant threat and stress. And the women on the other side, they can go and come as they please. And they have been a lot of cases of divorce where women left to the west of Europe or to the US and divorced their husbands, who remain in Ukraine, who have kind of cut ties with Ukraine. A lot of young Ukrainian women are studying abroad in special programs created for Ukrainians and get very, very good education abroad, start to speak excellent English, excellent other languages, and the chances are like the opportunities are wildly different between men and women, especially in the younger generation. And this is also something that might create tension in the future. We don't know. It's already creating tension now with some men not wanting to have girls on their Instagram feed because they will see pictures of them at the beach somewhere on holiday, and they don't want to see that. They don't want to be reminded of their own imprisonment, if you will. And this is a very complicated thing that has also no obvious solution. The idea of mobilizing women has not really been uh, around that much. I think they loosely talked about it, but I think it would be. I don't think this will happen. I don't think they will decide to mobilize women or force them to stay the way they force men. But this means that it creates a huge difference between men and women in the country. So these are the things that I see are probably very big psychological stressors and potential problems for after the war, or also if the war continues on for a very long time. So this is for Ukraine. When it comes to Russia, I think Russia, hopefully at some point, the Russian people will realize how horrible this whole thing has been. They will realize that they are somehow complicit to war crimes. They are complicit in some way because they let it happen to absolutely horrible things, such as kidnapping children in occupied territories, bringing them into Russia, making them lose their Ukrainian passport, and and destroying their own identity and destroying their Ukrainianness to try to make them hate Ukraine and make them love the country which very probably murdered their parents or their brothers, sisters, their friends, and this is so morally unacceptable that I cannot even wrap my head around, bombing hospitals, torturing prisoners of war. There are pictures of Ukrainian prisoners of war coming back from Russia with words like glory to Russia burned into their skin. This is such, yeah, it's so insanely criminal that you can't believe that this is done on such a big scale. And so at some point, hopefully, when this war ends, we will need justice. We will need to bring the people who perpetrated these crimes to be put in front of courts, to be put to justice. For the Ukrainian people to survive this war, for everyone to survive this war, there will have to be some sort of process. And at this point, the Russian people will have to realize that what was happening in their country because of their country was horrible. And maybe this reckoning will be really hard to have. I don't know if it makes sense to compare it to what Germany went through after the end of the Second World War. When information became public on concentration camps, on the absolute atrocity of the Holocaust, etc. I don't know if it makes sense to compare it, but probably the process will be in some ways similar, at least in some ways. And this might be very hard for the Russian society. It might be very hard to accept what has been happening and to understand that they have been living in some sort of alternate world, alternate reality for all this time. There is a good thing that you can compare it to, maybe the Soviet war in Afghanistan, the last war that the Soviet Union waged until 1989, where the Soviet Union justified this war by saying that they were helping the Afghani people, that they were helping them against some evil Western influence, and in reality helping the communist or socialist powers in place in Afghanistan. And the more the war went on, the less people understood why there were Soviet soldiers on Afghanistan territory. And when they came back, the Soviet Union kind of admitted that this war had been a little bit for nothing, and that, they didn't achieve anything, and that so many people had died for nothing, for political influence, really. And so, because of this, Soviet soldiers, who are now Russian citizens, who had been active in the Afghanistan war, were seen as criminals by their own people, because they were kind of conglomerated, like put together with this idea that this war had been criminal, had been for nothing. And so they were seen as kind of like, yes, as invaders, which they were, but it all comes back to what is personal responsibility versus collective responsibility, etc. But I think this might also be the case with the return of Russian soldiers. And it might also be, we also know that so many Russian soldiers are actually convicts, ex-prisoners. There are already many studies who show that Russian soldiers who come back to Russia are extremely violent, kill their girlfriends, kill their children, murder random people. This is also a problem, when you have people who are traumatized by war or who are shown such levels of violence without punishment. It's even, recommended to be so violent when you're a Russian war in the war in Ukraine. Come back to reality and adjust to a place where you cannot just go around and torture and murder people. And this is going to create also probably huge problems in Russian society, and the societal coming to terms with all of this, with these decades of living in lies. It's going to be awful. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I think it's going to be awful.
Pauline, you open so many doors. I will keep asking you so many things. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time anymore. But at least I will just ask you one last thing. I said at the beginning that we are not going to talk about the news. There are many channels, there are medias that do that, and it's not our intent. But at least I want just to spend one word about the meeting happened some days ago in Alaska between Trump and Putin. And actually, some analysts say that Trump, with this meeting, not really change the U.S. strategy. So the United States would still be pursuing global hegemony, keeping military pressure on Ukraine to weaken and divide Russia, while in the medium term, progressively shifting the burden of the war onto Europe in order to focus on the confrontation with China. So I'm just curious to ask you if you agree with that, and if Europe's dependence benefit the America army industry. So it's just condensed in a short answer. I don't know if I explained my question properly, because actually I wanted to make it as short as possible. But yeah, if you could express your opinion about that, about Trump's strategy, let's say.
Well, my opinion about Trump's strategy is that it's quite hard to understand, just like how Putin's strategy is quite opaque. We don't really understand what he's doing, why he's doing it, especially. He has many justifications, but the real reason why he's doing it, we don't really know. And Trump's strategy, I think he doesn't quite understand the conflict. He doesn't quite understand the war and what's happening. It's clear that he doesn't know. And there was this interview of him recently where he was like saying that Ukraine has a lot of ocean. I don't know in what parallel universe Ukraine has a lot of ocean, but anyway, so it's clear that he doesn't really understand what he's talking about. And so in this way, he can be used as what we call a useful idiot, which is a person who can take in some propaganda and become kind of a puppet to propaganda and kind of work in that way. And so if he does have a strategy, which I'm not sure I can understand if he does have one, it's clearly not working, and he's not going to be able to implement his strategy by meeting up with Putin, because by meeting up with Putin and by allowing him to have a platform, he is technically being Putin's useful idiot. He's allowing him to come back to the international scene, and he's rolling him the red carpet for some reason. And yeah, so I think Trump is just pursuing his own interests. He's trying to present himself as the main negotiator in the world, as the world's policeman. And I'm not sure whether this is working or not. We will see what comes out of the idea of a meeting between Zelensky, Putin, and himself. Maybe his kind of crazy strategy will bring some changes, which would be good or bad. I don't know. But I think what's certain is that he is following his own interests, the interests of the US, and that right now this European war is kind of not interesting for the US. And so I think he's kind of fed up with it. He is fed up with Putin, he's fed up with Zelensky, he's fed up with the Europeans, and he kind of wants, from what I see and what I understand, he wants to get rid of that problem as soon as possible. So that's what I think about it.
Thank you, Pauline. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you to have been here with us today. Maybe there will be a chance to meet again online and talk about maybe some good news. Let's see. This war is going on for too long now, so we just hope to have some good news soon. But exactly with Trump and Putin and those people, we are facing difficult times. But anyway, it was really a pleasure to have you here. I hope all the people that follow our conversation until now enjoyed, and for sure it was helpful and interesting by my side, but I'm sure also for the people who listen to us, otherwise they already left, but I hope not. And thank you very much again, and to all our people listen to us, see you for the next interview. Bye bye to everyone.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you for listening, and bye, everyone.